then you can't be considered rational. You can't be considered reasonable. You can't be considered intelligent. So you might say, well, Daniel, why don't you distinguish between a dunyawi sense of intelligence and a spiritual intelligence? Daniel, why don't you recognize that Stephen Hawking or Albert Einstein, weren't they intelligent? Weren't they intelligent as well? How can you deny this? But I do deny this. We must deny this. Their intelligence, if they can be called intelligence, is far from complete. They can't be considered intelligent when they see the world around us and they don't reflect and they don't understand that this didn't just come from nowhere. That this is not for no purpose. How can you think that? How can you understand your own purpose as a person? Everyone has goals. Everyone has aspirations in our lives, in our personal lives. Right? You might have a job, you might be going to college, you might be in high school, but you have a goal in life for yourself. How can you, when you're located, when you're within the universe, how can you have a purpose? But the universe itself has no purpose, has no direction, has no end? How does that make sense? Where does your purpose come from? These are the kinds of reflections that a person of reason, rationality, intelligence has to make. The signs are around us. They're not part of the ghaib. They're not unseen. So no, I don't think that Stephen Hawking or Albert Einstein are geniuses or they're intelligent. And I studied physics. So at Harvard I studied physics. And some of my professors and advisors were Nobel Prize winners as well. They were considered the top physicists in the world. I talked to them, I interacted with them, I took classes with them. I wouldn't consider them intelligent. The way that I think about their abilities are that they're savants. What, have you heard of the word savant? It means someone who has a very particular skill that's super, super specific. So in chess, for example, you can have a chess savant. Someone who's very, very good at chess. And you'll see them, they have events where there will be 50 people who come to play chess against one person. And that one chess savant, chess genius, will play all 50 people at the same time, blindfolded, and win 50 games. So this is a savant, meaning this is some unnatural, highly unusual ability that they have in chess. You have savants in video games. They're just at such a high level of ability that no one can match. And in physics, it's the same thing. In physics, it's the same thing. They're physics savants. But remember how we define intelligence. Intelligence is recognition of reality. But who gets to define what reality is? Who gets to define what reality is? Those who are materialists and atheists, they have defined reality as the physical world, the material world, atoms and molecules. They assert, dogmatically, blindly assert that there is no higher reality beyond what we see and touch and feel in terms of atoms and molecules. So according to their understanding of reality, then yes, a physicist, they would consider to be intelligent because the physicist understands or allegedly understands reality because he's or she is able to do physics. But we don't have to accept their definition. We don't have to submit to their definition of what reality is. Why would we? Why would we? Their understanding of reality changes every generation. I studied physics, I studied the philosophy of physics and science. The scientific reality in the time of Isaac Newton is very different than the scientific reality 200 years later when Albert Einstein came. And he redefined physics. And then later it was redefined again. And again and again. Science goes through revolutions. Science changes in big, significant ways. And your entire conception of what is real undergoes massive shifts. We're talking about atoms and molecules. Well, the physicists today, they say an atom is an illusion. An atom is an illusion. That's old talk. That's old science. Now we know the reality is not about atoms, it's about quarks. Quarks, the subatomic particle that they call quarks, and hadrons, and bosons, and the Higgs boson, and so on, all these different particles. That's the reality. And then there are even other physicists who say, no, the reality is strings. It's not even particles, it's strings. That's the reality. So even amongst themselves, there's khilaf. They disagree, even amongst themselves, on what is reality. So why should we accept those who, they're just engaged in speculation, dhann. They have no certain knowledge. But we have certain knowledge. We have revelation. We have the Quran. We have the Sunnah. This is what we should anchor ourselves to intellectually. This is what we should anchor our definition of intelligence. And as parents and educators, we have to plug in our children and our youth into these definitions, into these concepts. We can't let others and other ideologies define the terms for us. We have to play the same game and better than that. So I mentioned why it's so important to redefine intelligence and intellectual revival in terms of Islam for our youth. But also think about da'wah. Think about da'wah. How are we going to invite others to Islam if others think of Islam as stupid, irrational, immoral? How can we invite others and say, accept Islam. We invite you to good. Accept Islam. Allah says in the Quran, "Ud'u fi sabili rabbik bil-hikmah wal-maw'idatil hasanah." Invite to or call to the way of your Lord bil-hikmah, meaning with wisdom and good advice. And Allah also says in that same ayah, "Jadilhum billati hiya ahsan." Argue with them or debate with them. Jadilhum billati, with what is best. So again, this is a command from Allah. Allah is saying to argue and debate. And Allah wouldn't command us to do something if it were not possible. You see, the thing is that some people today, some Muslims, will say that, look, we have our religion, they have their religion, we are just going to practice and keep to ourselves privately. We don't need to argue with anyone. We don't need to try to convince anyone of the truth of Islam. It's fine. And they can insult us, and they can attack Islam. That's fine. We're just peaceful. We're in our own corner, and we don't need to engage. This is wrong. This is a big problem, because our youth are going to slowly leave, because you can't be told over and over and over again that what you believe and what you subscribe to in your life is irrational and immoral. You can't hear that over and over again and maintain your Iman. It's slowly going to cause you doubts, and then you're going to have problems, big problems. And then, like I said, we can't do da'wah. How can we call people to Islam if we don't respond to objections, if we don't respond to attacks? If I come up to you and I start insulting your mother, I start insulting your father, I say that, look, your mother and your father, they're stupid, they're irrational, are you going to say, oh, okay, and walk away and not respond? Not even have the bravery to say, no, that's not true, not even to deny them? No, of course, you're going to be emotional. You're going to say, no, that's not true. Don't say these things about my mom or my dad. How come we don't have that sense of ghairah, that sense of protective jealousy for Islam? How can we allow others to constantly attack and we have nothing to respond with? So it is our duty to have intellectual responses and to challenge our opponents. And we do this first and foremost by defining our own terms and setting the frame of our discourse. So, what's the time? So, let me wrap up then, inshallah. When it comes to practical things to do with your children, I think it's very important to control the sources of information. The sources of information. It's a very easy idea, but it's difficult to implement. As parents, do you know what are the primary sources of influence on your children? Huh? Social media? TV? Okay, that's very generic. Because do you know what on social media or TV, do you know what your kids are watching? Do you know who your kids are following? Do you know those details? My point is that it's very difficult to keep track. And especially as they grow older, but for younger children, that's when we have to start setting good habits and having a very solid grasp of what are our children consuming? Who are they following? What are they reading? What are they watching? And if you don't have good channels of communication with your children, they're not going to tell you. They're not going to tell you these things. So you're going to be in the dark, you're not going to know, and so you don't know what you don't know. If your child has doubts about Islam, they have these questions, most likely they're not going to come and talk to you about it. Right? And then, may Allah protect us from this. One day they come and say, oh, guess what? I'm not praying anymore. I'm not fasting. Or I don't feel like going to the masjid anymore. It's not really my scene. And then you wonder, well, what happened? 12 years of Islamic school, right? Because Islamic school is just 8 hours a day, maybe 40 hours a week. But what about the rest of the time outside of school? The rest of the hours of the week? And even within Islamic school, what about between classes? What about under the desk with friends? There are all these influences. And I know that you know all of these things. You're aware of these influences, but it's good to remind. It's good to remind that what is the most concerning is the ideologies that are being transmitted through these media, through social media, through internet, through TV, through movies, through music. Through music, right? So many different messages that are embedded. They're hidden. If you don't know what to look for, if you don't know what these ideologies are, you're not going to recognize them. So, I think that we as a community have to dedicate resources to understanding what these ideologies are. What is the source of these doubts? What are the source of these questions? So that we can inoculate. Just like there are vaccines. We use vaccines to prevent the possibility of infection. Okay, so we have to do the same thing intellectually, ideologically. How do we do that? That's a question that I can't give you the complete answer to in just this short session. Inshallah, in December, Brother Hassan is organizing a program where I'll be coming back, inshallah, to Tampa and teaching an intensive, 5-day intensive, where we go into all of the major ideologies that are attacking Islam and affecting youth and the entire Ummah, actually, in detail. We talk about atheism, we talk about materialism, we talk about secularism, we talk about liberalism, feminism, LGBT, evolution, all of these things in depth. And we spend 8 hours a day for 5 days on these topics, where not only we try to understand these ideologies, because that's easy. If anyone can understand these ideologies, if you have the time, you can read about them online. But it's not just about understanding the ideology. You have to take the extra step of showing how Islam is superior, how Islam provides the superior option, how Islam is more rational, Islam is more moral than what the secular scientific world has to offer. Because if you give youth two options, this is Islam and this is all of these popular isms, and you don't explain why one is better than the other, then they'll just choose whichever one is most popular and which one is more easy to accept. You have to take the extra step of actually justifying. So inshallah that will be in December, and I think Brother Hassan will explain some of the details of that. And may Allah make us people of haqq. May Allah protect our youth and our children and guide them and protect them from shubuhat and doubts and give them full confidence and yaqeen and keep them on the straight path. Ya Rab. Ameen. Subhanallah. Sure.
Do you want to have any questions?
Questions or comments?
Go ahead.
I enjoyed every minute that hour you were talking. I think it's great.
Jazakallah khair.
Go ahead.
How about sisters if they have questions? They
Well,
can
you have mentioned,
Hold on, wait, wait. No, that's
Okay, if sisters have any questions, they can text Brother Hassan.
mashallah, I think this is excellent. You mentioned systematic, their approach causing doubts in our youth. And we should have a systematic approach to respond to. So this is nice, coming 5 days and probably talk about this. But some of us don't have this opportunity to attend that. Do you have your website or something where you have put 20 or 30 doubts for the beginning and what is their response? One can learn, because I was just waiting for the whole lecture, how we can set that. But really, how do you think that the kuffar are living in this living, but how do we, what caused them to leave this Islam? And how can we find out before it happens? And how we can stop it?
Yeah, so let me repeat the question. The question is, what resources are there already to help with doubts and questions, and then what specific doubts cause our youth to leave Islam? So as for resources, I have a lot of writing online. I've been writing and researching for about 10 years now. And you can go to my website. It's Muslim Skeptic, SKEPPIC.com. And people find it a strange name, Muslim skeptic. What is the meaning of that? And the meaning is that usually we think of a skeptic as someone who doubts or has questions about religion and interrogates religion. But we can turn that on its head. We can turn the tables and say, well, there are all these dogmas and all these ideologies that people accept blindly, like feminism, secularism, liberalism, evolution, scientism. We need to question those. We need to be skeptical in those ideologies and attack them. And so that's where the name Muslim skeptic comes from. As for doubts, there are many different questions that the youth have nowadays. One of the big ones is the place of women in Islam, women's treatment in Islam, differences in fiqh between men and women. That's one of the big ones. Also LGBT. Why doesn't Islam recognize that a man and a man can love each other, love is love, all of these things that they're constantly being fed through social media, through the political and public discourse. So how can we empower our youth to understand this issue? We can tell them about Qawm Lut. We can tell them about what Allah says in the Quran about this behavior, same-sex behavior. But that's not enough these days, because the enemies of Islam and the promoters of this kind of behavior have a response already to that. They say, well, the Quran, this is referring to some other practice, or this is for old times, it's not as relevant. What can you find possibly wrong with this kind of behavior? For some people, it's natural. And so there's all kinds of moral argumentation that they use, and they consider it to be rational argumentation. How can Muslims respond to that? You can't just cite an ayah of the Quran or hadith. In order to address that issue, you have to have your own argument to be able to respond. And so I have an essay on this topic. You can read it through the website that I mentioned, muslimskeptic.com. But many things beyond this as well. What?
So most of these issues are addressed in your reference on the website?
Yeah, many of them are addressed on the website, and the course addresses most of them.
If anyone wants. Go ahead.
Children should be taught this minimum required Islamic knowledge so that they can learn cannot be in our reading, Islamic literature, and listening to the Islamic scholars.
Right.
They can be constantly on the Islamic path.
Yeah, I mean, in the ideal world, we could have our children constantly be reading Islamic literature and getting that kind of education, but fortunately, it's a lot of other factors that seem to be impacting youth in this day and age. Why or something?
One thing I was going to ask, I think in our society, one of the most elevated things is the human mind, and the human mind being the ultimate criterion for what's right and wrong, my rationality, my reasoning, my logic. And I think one thing as Muslims, we understand that guidance is not purely something that is rational. To think that our mind will be completely able to grasp everything is a sense of arrogance, right? And so I think the one thing I think that distinguishes us is the fact that yes, the mind and reason has its scope and has its limitation, but at the same time to set, for when people say in society that this is the ultimate criterion, that's a really big problem, because we know that our mind makes mistakes and our mind is limited. And that hidayah oftentimes is from Allah, you know, and it's not necessarily basically, you know, someone going to a philosophy class or someone going to a philosophy, you know, session or whatever it may be. Oftentimes you'll find those people some of the most misguided, right? So I guess kind of, if you could touch upon the concept of the mind and this kind of elevation of the mind in our society, and how that in of itself takes away the concept of hidayah and the concept of Allah guiding people and guiding the hearts.
Did everyone get that?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. Thank you for bringing that up. Absolutely, there are limits to our reason. And just like we have limits in our sight, you know, we can't see through walls. Similarly, the mind is also limited, and our sense of reason is limited. But we have to recognize that this can be used as a cop-out. This can be used as a cop-out in the sense that whenever there is a challenge, Islam is challenged on something, we say, oh, this is beyond reason, we just have to accept it, when that's not necessarily the case. Like, for example, prevention, when Allah says, don't approach zina, la taqrabu zina, this is a command that everyone understood in history as rational. This is something that is perfectly rational. Of course you don't approach, you don't engage in zina. And nowadays, since that's not in this culture, in the Western culture that's been disseminated across the world, that, yeah, what's wrong with premarital relations? What's wrong with that? Well, why can't we engage in fornication all we want? We don't see any problem with it. Then the Muslim response in some quarters is, oh, well, this is just ta'budi. It's not related to aqd. This is purely just a command that we have to blindly follow, and reason has nothing to do with it. So what changed? The only thing that changed is that the dominant culture changed, whereas as far as reason is concerned, of course, why would you engage in zina when it's such a destructive act for children who are born not knowing who their fathers are. And there's all kinds of even secular statistics, scientific statistics that show that children who are born out of wedlock in single-parent families or single-parent households are at greater risk to fall into crime, are greater risk of becoming homeless, are at greater risk of dropping out of school, are at greater risk of doing drugs, are at greater risk of falling into crime. These are at a much higher risk. Like, these are all established statistics. And it's obvious why. Like, you're growing up without knowing who your father is. It's an unstable household. There's going to be a much greater chance for all of these negative repercussions for the child. And if that child is growing up in society and then becoming a part of that society, that negativity will spread and affect and corrupt all of society. I don't want to live in a society where there's higher drug usage, higher joblessness, higher homeless rate, all of these things. It affects me personally. It affects all of us personally when others are engaged in zina. It's not a victimless crime as it's put in society nowadays. So yes, of course, this is a victim. There's victims in this crime, and we need to, we should look at the Sharia, which curbs this behavior, as being the most rational, the most moral approach. Okay? And this shows the superiority of Islam. This shows the truth of Islam, that this prohibition of zina is so firm and so solid, and our tradition has maintained that in a pristine way, whereas other faiths have abandoned it as soon as it became culturally unacceptable or unpopular. But reflecting on these things rationally, it boosts, the Iman, and this is all rational. So, but going back to the original point of, the limits of reason, yes, there are limits. Like, we don't know why Allah has prescribed 3 rakat for Maghrib, or why we fast in Ramadan as opposed to Shawwal or Sha'ban. These are ta'budi. Ta'budi meaning dealing with worship. Allah has just prescribed it. But the central truths of Islam, that Allah exists, was not considered to be just beyond human reason, beyond the aql. The truth of Islam itself was not considered beyond aql. This is another issue where youth are very confused. I get asked all the time, I believe in God, but I don't know why Islam is true. Like, why should I believe Islam is true? And then people are at a loss of how to respond to this very common question. So we have to be careful about this line of thought that, oh, our aql is limited. Yes, absolutely, it is. At the same time, we shouldn't think that the main truths of Islam are not unreachable by reason, by aql. And there's no difference of opinion by this amongst the scholars of Islam historically.
Since we only have 2 minutes, can they just say their comments and then just do a final one? You guys your hand up? Today?
What's the difference between intellect and wisdom? And can you have one without the other?
Yeah, there are different categories. So again, if we want to define them in Islamic terms, you have hikmah and you have aql. And so someone can have aql, that's considered a very basic level, aql. And this was actually the definition that was used for man. The scholars of Islam wanted to know what is a good definition of man. And they said man is the rational animal. That's what distinguishes humans from the rest of the animal world, is that we have aql. So that's the basic, as long as you're not crazy or you're not, a young child, you have the ability to reason and reflect. But hikmah is a higher level of intelligence. And intelligence as a word is, it's not an Arabic term, but we can use it as a gloss, as a general term, and then we define the details and the nuance using Arabic.
My comment was, I went to Islamic school here, a lot of brothers here went to Islamic school, and we graduated early 2000, and we never ever heard of anybody from our school or anything leaving Islam, ever. It was never, or even any of the schools next to us. But within the last couple of years, some of the graduates of our Islamic schools here have left Islam, And so, I've been trying to figure out what's changed in 15 years and 13 years that could, cause this. I found some research of, there's documents out there that, that they're,